Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on evaluative thinking. My name is Tom Archibald, and I'm an assistant professor at Virginia Tech, and I'm also on the leadership team of the Organizational Learning and Evaluation Capacity Building Topical Interest Group at AEA. So on behalf of the rest of my leadership team, I'm very happy to welcome you here today, and I'm especially happy to welcome Leslie Fierro and Ann Bowe, both of whom will be sharing some thoughts with us today on evaluative thinking. So just as a reminder, everyone's been placed on mute to reduce background noise. So please do keep yourself muted throughout the presentation. We will have time for questions and answers at the end, in which point you could either unmute yourself and share a question verbally, or at any point throughout the presentation, feel free to write a question into the chat, and I will be moderating that, as well as presenting as the third presenter in this webinar as well. We have a lot of exciting material to cover, so we're going to get to it very shortly. Also, just to note, this webinar is being recorded so that we can share it with some folks who weren't able to join us live and in person here. And also at the end, in the chat box and on the screen, you'll be directed to a very brief survey to provide some feedback to us, the OLECB TIG team, as we prepare further webinars down the road. This is an occasional webinar series where we try to offer the community some interesting ideas about organizational learning and evaluation capacity building. So before I turn the floor over to Leslie, who will start, I just want to say that this particular webinar is extra special for us because the three of us, along with a number of other colleagues, were able to work together to put out this volume of new directions for evaluation on evaluative thinking. And so Leslie and Ann and myself will be talking about some of our work that we presented in this volume. Also, for those of you who will be attending the evaluation conference in a few weeks here in Cleveland, we're happy to say that we have two panels in which authors of all of the chapters that are represented in this volume will be presenting, which includes Michael Patton, Tom Schwant, teams of Ann Bowe's colleagues and Leslie Fierro's colleagues, as well as my colleagues from USAID and CRS, and my colleague Jane Buckley, and Leah Neubauer, Stephen Brookfield, as well as Nanwa Fahanana and Kate McKay. So you don't want to miss those panels if you will be at AEA. And, but at least today you'll get a little bit of a sneak peek of some of the material that Leslie and Ann and myself will be able to share with you. So without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen, and Leslie, you can take it away.
Okay, sounds good. Can you hear me all right?
Sounds good over here, yes.
Okay, great.
And I'll let you know when I can see your screen. And there it is, looks good.
Okay, fantastic. Well, so as Tom mentioned, my name is Leslie Fierro. I'm an assistant clinical professor here at Claremont Graduate University. And just want to thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to share the work that I conducted with some of my students and some former colleagues from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention with you. So first, I want you to imagine for a moment, if you will, that you've been invited to join a wonderful friend and colleague for a cup of coffee one afternoon at a lovely little coffee shop in Santa Monica, California. And the purpose of this meeting is to catch up a little and to share some updates on work-related projects. As you stare down into your coffee mug, briefly your friend says, "Hey, Tom Archibald and I have been chatting about pulling together a new directions for evaluation volume on evaluative thinking. And I was wondering if you might be interested in participating. Maybe writing a chapter that is focused on evaluative thinking in the context of domestic evaluation practice." Quickly, almost reflexively, without much thought, you say, "No." But after chatting for about an hour and a half, you begin to see why this might be a good idea. Many of us, particularly those of us on this call, are often implementing ECB approaches in organizations. These approaches are designed to increase one or more aspects of individual or organizational level capacity, which we can think of as short and midterm outcomes. Many of these evaluation capacity constructs have now been examined, and several of the ones that you see here are reflected in numerous instruments that are designed to assess the evaluation capacity of organizations. However, what we ultimately want to affect by building evaluation capacity is presumably something related to how organizations practice evaluation, including what activities they employ as part of this practice and the qualities of evaluation as a function within their organization. These qualities may include an internal rather than solely external motivation to engage in evaluation, creating an environment within which evaluation is deeply embedded, so a context in which evaluation is a natural workflow, like any other in the organization, and is seamless with other activities. This can also include an environment in which people think evaluatively. Now, wouldn't it be great if, as evaluation capacity builders, we could know at least what to keep our eye on to see if evaluative thinking was increasing or changing in some way as we were working with our clients? And wouldn't it be nice if we had some indicators that represent dimensions of evaluative thinking so we could integrate them into our efforts to evaluate our ECB initiatives? So it's from this point in this discussion that the study was really born. We thought that it would be ideal to identify a context where there's a strong history of building evaluation capacity. And we were working under the assumption that if strong evaluation capacity existed, then evaluative thinking might also exist. And then what we could do is systematically collect qualitative data with the intention of answering the research question, how do instances of evaluative thinking present in practice-based settings? So it occurred to me that we might have exactly the perfect study context within the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's National Asthma Control Program, which is a place where I worked some time ago. Now, by way of background, in 2009, with leadership support and encouragement, the National Asthma Control Program launched a strategy to build and advance evaluation capacity among their funded programs. During a 5-year funding cycle that spanned from 2009 to 2014, the National Asthma Control Program designated program evaluation as an explicit priority. Managers and evaluators within this national program developed a multi-pronged approach to build evaluation capacity within the state grantee programs that drew heavily upon CDC's framework for program evaluation and public health. And central to this approach were requirements that state asthma programs hire an evaluator at least half-time, create and submit evaluation plans, and routinely report status updates on the evaluative efforts to the national office. To promote the successful implementation of these new requirements and to model the importance of evaluation, the national program established their own team of evaluators, who they called the Evaluation Technical Advisors, who I was one of at one point in time. The primary role of these advisors was to work with evaluators in the funded programs to strengthen and expand evaluation capacity with the ultimate goal of fostering high-quality evaluations that produce findings that stakeholders can use. The advisors implemented a comprehensive strategy for building evaluation capacity, which included, but was definitely not limited, to producing a multi-module guidance and learning document, which I have a picture of here, Learning and Growing Through Evaluation, hosting peer-to-peer learning sessions through quarterly grantee calls and in-person roundtables, and conducting in-person and virtual training sessions. Now, since the National Asthma Control Program had a systematic and comprehensive approach to building evaluation capacity with their grantees for almost a decade when we kind of began to conceptualize this study, it really seemed like the perfect context in which to do our study. If instances of evaluative thinking were present, wouldn't they be present in a program like this one? Additionally, we had some early indicators that evaluation capacity existed in this program and that evaluative thinking was taking shape from some internal and external assessments that had been performed on evaluation capacity previously, as well as some observations of the evaluation technical advisors and the 2014 and 2019 applications that states had submitted at this point. So on this slide, I'll give you a brief overview of the study methodology. We initiated the study by first engaging as a team, which was comprised of 2 federal practitioners in the National Asthma Control Program, 3 doctoral students, and myself, to review 4 administrative documents from a sample of 6 grantee sites that had a range of evaluation capacity. This really helped us to learn more about what was in the available documents and their potential utility for the study, and to give a go at leveraging existing theory, literature, and our own experiences in developing a set of a priori indicators of evaluative thinking. After we revised and refined our methodology, we launched the formal study. The first phase of the study included reviewing 3 documents, which included the state's most recent funding application, a strategic evaluation plan, and a plan for a specific evaluation in 4 states: Massachusetts, Montana, Oregon, and Wisconsin. Now, these 4 states had exhibited a high level of evaluation capacity relative to other state asthma programs. Assessments of this capacity were based on a systematic rating process that the evaluation technical advisors went through, and the results from a prior assessment of evaluation capacity and practice that I had conducted. In the second phase of this study, we conducted semi-structured telephone interviews with the program manager and the evaluator from each of the 4 selected state asthma programs, and we subsequently facilitated a telephone focus group with these 8 individuals. In each phase, we refined and added to the list of indicators of evaluative thinking through content analysis, which was performed by 2 of our team members. So here's an overview of the study results. 22 indicators of evaluative thinking emerged from this study. We grouped these indicators under the 5 large headings, which are captured and defined here. In the published manuscript, we provide additional details about the 22 indicators and share an example of text we coded under the indicator. I'll provide you with an overview of each category now, as well as a snapshot of a few indicators that fall under each of these 5 overarching headings. So the first category is reflecting, which we defined as deliberatively giving critical attention to various aspects of a program, including its context and its evaluation, which suggests a willingness to apply a critical lens reflexively. We grouped 6 indicators of evaluative thinking under this heading, and some examples include asking thoughtful questions, considering context, which included an awareness and responsiveness to changes in the environment, and something we called evaluation review, in which grantees made efforts to examine or judge the quality of its evaluation work or assess the performance of the evaluators. The second category was perspectives, which we defined as incorporating information and priorities from multiple viewpoints. Some examples of indicators here include soliciting a diverse range of stakeholder views and perspectives on the evaluand, which we termed multiple perspectives, and explicating value, which included, explicating values, which included consideration of the values that are pertinent to the evaluation and can or should influence the evaluation process, the program theory, what constitutes credible evidence, and of course the findings and recommendations. The third category was projecting, which is envisioning success and a path to achieving it. So items we included under here included clearly articulating criteria for success, and recognizing that evaluation activities are conducted as a suite of studies as opposed to individual events. Fourth, we had valuing evaluation. Indicators under this heading included statements where programs indicated a belief in the importance and utility of evaluation and a program's intent to engage in evaluation capacity building. And then last but not least was the category of use, under which we grouped indicators that suggested the program had plans for using evaluation findings, instances of instrumental or process use, and integration of evaluation within the routine practices of an organization. So I want to close out by circling back to one of our purposes in doing this study, which was to understand how evaluative thinking may manifest in practice settings. So as practitioners, we will know what to look for when we're performing our work. 22 indicators is a lot to look for. So let's take a few examples and see how they might play out in a practical setting. Our hope is that the following hypothetical examples will provide you with an impetus to look at the manuscript, particularly table 3.1 of the manuscript, to think about how the indicators we identified might manifest in your particular work context. So first, I'll start with the reflecting category. And so a hypothetical example here might show a situation where people are asking questions such as, does this intervention result in fewer emergency department visits for asthma in children? And ultimately a movement towards asking questions such as, how does this intervention contribute to reductions in emergency department visits for asthma in children? Or what proportion of children who engage in this intervention get a high enough dose of the program to reduce the likelihood of a future emergency department visit? So here we see a movement from asking yes/no questions to one in which stakeholders are more likely to ask deeper, richer questions about the program's implementation and effects. There's another hypothetical example to kind of articulate the movement we might see in evaluative thinking when we're thinking about perspectives, or the perspectives category. So we might see movement from a situation in which evaluation planning meetings include the client or funder and the evaluator or evaluation team, to a situation in which evaluation planning meetings are hosted with a broad array of stakeholders. And there are engaged discussions that examine different viewpoints on credible evidence, shape a rich understanding of the context, and highlight multiple potential areas of inquiry. So here we would see a movement from a situation in which the evaluator is viewed as the person who's solely responsible for engaging in evaluation or evaluations that primarily consider the evaluation funder's point of view in shaping, the evaluation purpose, questions, design, to which there's recognition and action to support this recognition of multiple viewpoints and engagement of multiple perspectives. We go from a narrow window here to a broader base. And then finally, a hypothetical example of what we mean in the projecting category. So here you might see movement from a situation in which a program's evaluating the utility of, say, asthma surveillance products. And just by way of background, asthma surveillance products might include presentations or reports of trends in the prevalence and risk factors associated with asthma. So they'd be evaluating the utility of these products among several intended target audiences. And you'd see a movement towards a situation in which they're now evaluating the extent to which at least one clear action has been taken within the past 12 months based upon surveillance data among the program's 5 key partners, and performing subsequent evaluations to better understand the successes of the actions partners took based upon findings from the surveillance data. So here what we see is a movement away from a situation in which the level of utility is undefined to one in which forethought has been given to what good utility might be, as well as a recognition that evaluations tie together, that what we learn about an evaluand overall is the result of conducting several evaluations and thinking about how they interlink rather than just taking them one at a time. So that's a brief summary of the work that's described in much greater detail in our manuscript. We hope that the information we provide is helpful to you in your practice and are open to answering whatever questions you might have. I believe we'll be taking questions at the end of our presentations. If we don't get around to some that you have about the study today, or you think of ones in the future, please do feel free to reach out to me at the email address listed on this slide. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Leslie. That was excellent. Great snapshot of your chapter. Hopefully folks will, if they haven't read it yet, want to go find that and look a little bit deeper. And thank you especially for highlighting the implications for practice. I know a lot of folks will appreciate that. So Anne, if you could start sharing your screen here and unmute yourself. We're going to turn it over to Anne Vo. And there's a really nice thread here because as Leslie was just presenting some empirical research on ECB, Anne Vo will be presenting some work on some really groundbreaking conceptual research that she's done on evaluative thinking within the context of ECB and even more broadly across other fields. So with that, Anne, take it away.
Thanks so much, Tom. And greetings, everyone. My name is Ann Bowe. I'm on the faculty in the Department of Medical Education at the Keck School of Medicine of USC, the University of Southern California, where I also serve in the capacity of the Director of Educational Research. Well, first, I'd just like to welcome and thank you for joining us today. And before I dive in, I'd also like to thank the Organizational Learning and Evaluation Capacity Building TIG for having me today, as well as extend a special thank you to Tom for organizing this webinar. Um, Leslie, Tom, and my work on evaluative thinking has been ongoing for a number of years now. And much of what has informed our efforts, like many of you here, I'm sure, is our fieldwork, our interaction with the literature, and our critical reflections on these encounters. And a challenge that we have shared over the years as well is not quite being able to put a finger on what evaluative thinking is and how do we know it when we see it. So as you've already heard, this was one of the primary motivators for organizing and putting together the New Directions volume. This work is particularly influenced by writings of evaluation thought leaders, including Michael Scriven, Carol Weiss, Ernie House, and many, many others. It's truly a communal effort. And collectively, what we've seen is that their work suggests that the evaluation field's identity is grounded in a robust knowledge base, in real world practice, and a commitment to ethical practice, and that the knowledge base itself specifically needs to reflect a core identity. Because as Scriven has noted, without it, evaluation can't have a self-concept, a definition, integrating concepts, or even plausible accounts of its limits and basic assumptions. So the argument that I'm making in my paper is that evaluative thinking is a part of that core identity. And in the chapter specifically, I set out to understand what the published literature indicates about the nature of evaluative thinking and its relationship to other core evaluation concepts. And this was done by coupling and applying principles of a systematic literature review and a conceptual analysis. So using the combination of manual, keyword, and proximity strategies to search the literature yielded a data set of over 7,000 articles, book chapters, papers, and other texts across a number of different fields and disciplines. Of course, that number is quite large and couldn't possibly be coded thoroughly or systematically. So my team and I articulated 4 inclusion criteria that were then used to filter and identify 221 records that were more carefully read and analyzed. And what this process resulted in was 256 excerpts that were then iteratively reviewed and coded. As you can see from this slide, the majority of excerpts were from the evaluation literature, which probably isn't a large surprise. However, work in psychology, education, and the natural sciences were also represented, though to a much lesser degree. From these excerpts, we developed a concept map that was used to support the process of identifying patterns and themes and relationships among codes and excerpts. And this process resulted in 69 codes that were then organized into 7 key code clusters. The code density and co-occurrence are represented here through the relative size of each cluster and their intersections. And this analysis subsequently led to the identification of 4 overarching domains that hold the clusters together. One of the domains had to do with values, which deal with societal and discipline-specific standards that serve as catalysts for evaluation. The second domain is cognition, which addresses the internal thinking process in which each evaluator takes part, along with the cultural norms that guide how each organization or group engages with evaluation. The third domain is application, and that pertains to the doing of the evaluation, employing methods to gather data and conduct analyses that ultimately result in the valuing of what's being evaluated. And by that, I mean the ascription of merit and worth. So taken together, what I'm hoping to convey with this model is the notion that values and valuing inform and reinforce each other, and that cognition and application create opportunities to challenge perceptions and beliefs that are shaped by values, as well as support the systematic derivation of an evaluand's value. Now, what we take away from this analysis is a few features of evaluative thinking that consists of interaction with multiple value systems. That entails the commitment to those virtues and procedures that support the representation of truth in context, and that reflects the ability to creatively navigate uncertainty, ambiguity, and complexity. And that it involves the investigation of one's own as well as others' positionality, assumptions, motivations, and biases. In the same vein, what the literature suggests as well is that evaluative thinking doesn't run counter to democratic ideals. And here I have to qualify that these ideals, as they are conceived of in the West or in Western cultures, that it does not involve reasoning with invalid evidence, and that it doesn't consist of passive or uncritical consumption of information. And it doesn't entail the obfuscation of truth. Likewise, I think importantly, the implications for practice here are three big takeaways, and they include the need to interrogate and incorporate complementary as well as conflicting values in an evaluation, the need to consider and apply systems thinking principles as appropriate, as well as to prioritize the attainment of long-term ends involving the building of an evaluation culture over that of short-term gains of just simply getting the work done for its own sake. And with that, I have a short list of references that might be helpful for those who are interested. And of course, in the same spirit, these issues and topics are discussed at much greater length in the NDE chapter that I also invite you to review. And if there are any questions, please feel free to share them in the chat box, and we will take them at the end of the presentation. But also, please feel free to reach out to me as well. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and pass it back to Tom.
Thank you, Anne. That was wonderful. And really, I love how the two bodies of work that have been presented hang together to provide both a conceptual and an empirical examination of evaluative thinking. And so certainly folks feel free to write some questions in the chat as we go, and then we will address those shortly after I present on actually two additional chapters in the volume, but which really build on a lot of what Anne has just been speaking about in terms of the role of evaluative thinking as a way to navigate uncertainty and complexity, to work with assumptions, and to really try to promote some democratic ideals in society. So with that, let me pull up my presentation, and we will continue on. Okay, sorry, technical difficulties. Okay. Okay, sorry for that short delay. So I have the honor of actually sharing 2 chapters with you, which all relate to the common theme of evaluative thinking for learning, adaptive management, and social justice, getting back to that point Anne made about the democratic ideals. So here's the info for both of these chapters. The first one I'll be spending a little bit more time on was written in collaboration with Guy Chirac from Catholic Relief Services, Jane Buckley from JCB Consulting, and Stacy Young from USAID, the United States Agency for International Development. And this chapter relates to another chapter I'll be sharing briefly on from my colleagues Leah Neubauer from Northwestern University, and Stephen Brookfield, who has been an inspiration for Leah and myself and many other people for a long time about critical thinking, critical theory, and we were really overjoyed to get to explore with him how that pertains to evaluative thinking. Now, before I introduce the work with CRS and USAID, I want to just share the guiding definition that my colleagues and I have used in our work on evaluative thinking. And I think what you'll find is that there's a strong degree of overlap with both the results from Leslie and her team's study and Anne and her team's study. So even though there's still some evolution to this concept, I think, and perhaps you in your own work with ECB, you've seen this manifest itself in different ways. I think it's really nice that we're starting to see a lot of consilience, a lot of coming together. So for us, it really has to do with a type of critical thinking, but as Anne and Tom Schwandt and Michael Patton have pointed out, it's certainly more than critical thinking, but we're interested in the role of critical thinking in ET. And then it's applied in the context of evaluation, or really project management writ large, motivated by an attitude of inquisitiveness and a belief in the value of evidence. And then it involves these 4, you could almost think of them as behavioral indicators, just like Leslie's team was able to identify. And these are identifying assumptions, posing thoughtful questions, pursuing deeper understanding through reflection and perspective taking, and then informing decisions in preparation for action. So you hear many echoes of the work that's been presented by my 2 colleagues previously. So in the context of our work with Catholic Relief Services and USAID, we frame this really in terms of this ongoing increasing recognition about the complexity and the unpredictability of many economic and social development processes. This is what Tom Schwandt has now been advocating for in terms of post-normal evaluation to deal with this complexity turn where it's hard to know with any certainty what to do next given all that's going on in the world today. So we see a paradigm shift that's taking place away from linear and reductionistic models towards more dynamic and reflective and responsive models. I've shared up here the Cunefin framework put forward by Dave Snowden and certainly popularized within evaluation by Michael Patton. And many of our traditional evaluation and then by default ECB approaches are well suited for the simple and perhaps the complicated realms. When really many of the programs that we're working on and in which we're trying to build evaluation capacity are actually more likely in the complex realm, where we need to do something like probing, sensing, and responding through our evaluation. So our question is, how can we build evaluation capacity for evaluative thinking in a way that is appropriate for such a complex and dynamic environment? So in this context, USAID has recently, in the past few years, updated its policies to really articulate the agency's desire to become more of an effective learning organization. And similarly, Catholic Relief Services, which receives some funding from USAID along with other sources, they have articulated a strong goal to promote evaluative thinking in pursuance of their own agency's strategic agenda for what they call MEAL, monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning. So today I'm going to share with you a few helpful tools which could perhaps, even if you're not working in international development, still be really helpful for you as you try to embed evaluative thinking and reflective action into your work with organizations. The first is the CLA framework, or Collaborating, Learning, and Adapting. And this is now formally part of the USAID programming cycle, where implementing partners and missions based around the world, as they plan their programs, are ideally going to refer to this. And it's a handy heuristic device that helps folks think about how they're going to embed learning, adapting, culture change, processes, resources, and collaboration into their programmatic framework. Much more information on the CLA framework and other related resources can be found here at the USAID Learning Lab with their CLA, or Collaborating, Learning, and Adapting Toolkit. And so the links, you can just Google CLA Toolkit USAID and you'll get this. And I can also provide the links to some of these resources when we send the recording out. So there's really a great amount of resources here. In addition, USAID and some of its partners have been doing some really good systematic review of the evidence base about how CLA, which has a strong overlap with evaluative thinking, what it actually does. So if a program or organization is doing more collaborating, learning, and adapting, what evidence do we have of change in that respect? So that's something else that I would encourage you to check out later. In the case of CRS, Guy, Jane, and myself were able to develop a really, I think, robust ECB approach, stretching out over 3 years and working with 3 different levels of the hierarchical system, because we found that really for ET to take hold, it needs to be simultaneously a bottom-up approach, but that also has strong support from leadership, so bottom-up and top-down. So you see here in this graphic just a really quick summary of the topics that we cover, and this also manifests the principle of scaffolding, sort of pedagogical notion of we can't just show up within an organization or a program and say, let's question all of the fundamental assumptions about how you do your work. So we were able to work at the different levels across years to do this sort of in a piecemeal fashion. It has a lot to do with articulating theories of change and the different assumptions that go into them. We've actually written a separate paper on that if you're interested in that particular approach. But it's really amazing what happens when you allow program implementers to articulate their own theory of change, step back, do peer review, identify the assumptions that are hidden within that theory of change diagram, and then come up with deeper questions, sometimes which require a full-blown evaluation, sometimes which require just simple inquiry, like rapid cycles of feedback in order to do adaptive management and learning. All of these resources are now freely and publicly available through the Catholic Relief Services website. The link is there on the left. And there's a series of videos that could potentially be useful if you're trying to introduce the concept of evaluative thinking to people who are not familiar with it. And we have a handful of other resources that we've accumulated as we've done our work with CRS, predominantly in Zambia, Ethiopia, and Malawi. Now to turn briefly to the chapter that I was able to write with Leah Neubauer and Stephen Brookfield. This one builds on the work that we presented already today, but also takes a slightly different, almost more philosophical perspective that has to do with evaluative thinking as a way of helping us evaluators and also helping the citizenry in society be more critically reflective in the pursuance, ultimately, of democratic aims, democratic pursuits, and social justice. So in this case, we're looking at evaluative thinking as it pertains to, once again, to come back to what Anne wrapped up with, values, valuing, and then what Tom Schwant would call the social process of value. And that's really thinking about who decides what the criteria for success are of a program, who decides what the scope and scale of the evaluative focus are. All of these questions, which seem like they might be simple and technical, are actually very power-laden. So as an ECB practitioner, it's incumbent on us to think about who's making these decisions and how does that ultimately reflect the role of evaluation in that organization and in society at large. And so as I've hinted at, this is against a type of values-free, technical rationalistic evaluation, which is only for compliance and audit purposes, which can lead to a society which is all about surveillance, including self-surveillance. So eschewing that notion, which I would say is what happens if you have evaluation without any evaluative thinking, what we're talking about is how to use evaluative thinking within ECB and other contexts to move towards a more democratic, a notion of democratic professionalism, practical reason, and critically reflective judgment in practice. So in thinking about this, we were actually drawn to some other recent work by Michael Patton in his New Directions for Evaluation volume on drawing on Paulo Freire's pedagogy in terms of what can we think about would be a pedagogy of evaluation. So his volume was not about evaluative thinking, but you see how many times evaluative thinking and notions related to it show up here in these 10 principles for the pedagogy of evaluation. We need to use evaluative thinking to open up, develop, and nurture critical consciousness. And this consciousness is a communal, social process. It has to be interactive and dialogical. It has to integrate reflection and action. As we've said many times, there has to be a valuing of both the objective and the subjective, the thinking and the emotion. And so you can go on and see that evaluative thinking is at the heart of this pedagogy of evaluation. So just to wrap up, our study of evaluative thinking for critically reflective practice drew us to really realize that we haven't paid enough attention within the field of evaluation on reflective practice. Here you have Van Dranen saying that, you know, reflective practice is one of the domains of competency, but there's very little literature on it, and I would say there's very little training on it. When we create an evaluative thinking workshop, or rather an evaluation capacity building workshop, where's the space for reflection? Where is the room for people to really practice that competency of reflective practice? So we identified 4 different levels at which reflection ought to be happening in evaluation. And these 4 levels are the following. At a macro level, I think it's important for all of us evaluators to reflect on the role of evaluation in society. So are we going more towards a professional practice of technical rationalism, where all we do is provide a technical service to people who need it? Or are we that developmental evaluation critical friend, providing evidence and insight in a way to foster reflection? So we need to ask about that. Secondly, and this gets back to the competency question, as you see here from this quote from Stefan King, Deer, and Minima, reflection is indeed one of the competencies. And as one, in particular, we should always be reflecting on our own need for further professional development. So this is certainly true of the program implementers with whom we work, but we also need to practice reflexivity, where we look at ourselves in the mirror and see, where can I as an evaluator or as an ECB practitioner continue to advance my practice? Then, and this is the one that's often the most overlooked, there's micro reflections about when you decide which type of logic model to use, which survey to use, whether you have the right evaluation question or not. And when you're sitting alongside program implementers helping them do this, how do you know what's the right decision to make? This is something that ultimately relies on practical wisdom and thereby relies on evaluative thinking. And then finally, we have what we're able to do today, which is the meta-reflection. And this is largely the stuff that evaluation theory is made of. But I think when you consider evaluative thinking within an ECB context, it allows us an opportunity to demystify theory and remystify practice. So that even if the program implementers with whom you work say, why are you talking to me about theory? It's not just about citing the right theories and getting into the weeds. It's about thinking critically about the decisions that they make and why they make them. And that brings me to my final point, which could be the subject of a whole separate webinar, but that is the role of power. And when we talk about critical theory, critical thinking, and critically reflective practice, we must talk about power dynamics and admit that There are people in different positions of power within the evaluation sphere, from the funder to the commissioner, to the evaluator, to the ECB provider, to the program implementer, and to the eventual beneficiary of that program. So this is a tool here from John Gaventa and the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex, which is a nice heuristic go-to tool for identifying power. Because as ECB practitioners and evaluators, in order to really practice evaluative thinking, we have to help people identify the power dynamics and decide how they can intervene to promote more social justice. So finally, that brings me to my ultimate goal of working with evaluative thinking, which is taken from a quote from Jean King, who said that the ultimate goal of evaluation capacity building is free-range evaluation, which she described as evaluative thinking that lives unfettered in an organization. And we could extend that to say in a society, so that we have what Schwant has called an intelligent belief in evaluation, not just in organizations, but across society writ large. So with that, I thank you, and we have some time for questions. So we have a few questions in the chat already. Anne and Leslie, why don't you go ahead and unmute yourselves, and then we can just jump into these. We'll start, let's see here. Leslie Hedberg Thinker, because there is a huge version in front of the Cleveland Museum of Art. Oh, yes. You saw that I used that as well. Yeah, I don't think that was purposeful, but we'll take that, right, Leslie? We're actually doing
Absolutely.
Thank you for that. Please share some insights on the role or influence of power on perspectives. So I just wrapped up talking about power, but I'll throw it back to you. I think this came in when you were talking about perspectives, Leslie. Yeah. Studies or in your other work, how has the role of power vis-a-vis different perspectives come to the fore for you?
Well, it's interesting because I was looking back at the various indicators that we had under perspectives and thinking about where power might be captured, right, in what we reviewed. Now, to my knowledge, we didn't necessarily have any text or I don't remember any comments in the interviews or focus groups around power specifically. But I certainly think that if it were to arise as a topic, right, or a conversation in this program or other programs, that it might be nested under things like additional points of view, right, captured under an indicator like that, or certainly in explicating values, right, which ties directly back to what Anne was talking about, and then also what Tom was just speaking to as well.
Yes, certainly. That, and the whole values question is one which has, as Anne indicated, is part of a long history of thinking about evaluation, but I see it popping up more and more because I think it's something that's been neglected. So values and power and knowledge are also interwoven. That's I agree, that's definitely one way in which power comes to the fore. Another question, this one from Kylie, for, I believe for you, Leslie. Realistic evaluation budgets as an indicator. Perhaps you set it up by saying CDC invests quite a bit in evaluation and ECB, so that's why you looked there. But I wonder what you think about the relationship between a good budget and then evaluative thinking as being presented.
Yeah, so it's an excellent question. I think where it comes into play, at least in how we categorize things and what we saw emerging as indicators, that something like this would really situate well under considering context. So that's really thinking about being responsive and adaptive to the environment, right, in which we find ourselves. And so one of the examples that we give from the text we coded in the manuscript relates to somebody talking about how they have to be very adaptive and realistic about the extent and level of involvement and feasibility of involvement from various stakeholders in the evaluation process, right? So that, you know, healthcare practitioners, for example, are incredibly busy, and how can they kind of, you know, they have to be very cognizant of that. So that's the kind of the example that we use for considering context. I mean, you could certainly imagine another quote arising, right, that would be reflective of that same type of integration of thinking about feasibility with respect to you know, realistic budget limitations for evaluations as well.
Absolutely. We have another question about how to measure reflection, and that's a tricky one. So Jane Buckley and I created a tool, a self-report survey, to try to measure evaluative thinking, which some others have picked up and done some work with, such as Heather Codd and also McIntosh. But it's not perfect, and reflection is a hard thing to know it when you see it. And that's why I so deeply appreciate the work that Anne has done conceptually and the work Leslie and her team have done empirically to help elucidate further indicators. But I think we still need to look to other fields like education and cognitive science, and try to pick up additional ways of organizational learning being one as well, which is part of this TIG. To see how people do try to collect data on reflection. Because ultimately, organizations who are investing in a culture of evaluative thinking, they do want to measure whether reflection is increasing. I think you might find some, not necessarily measures of reflection, but within the USAID evidence base on CLA, you could find evidence of how doing reflection then led to more downstream positive outcomes. And we found that within CRS as well. When reflection was embedded into ongoing monthly meetings, we have empirical, concrete evidence that decisions were made which ultimately led to adaptive management and better programs. But we're sort of jumping over the middle. We're not really able to say anything concrete about reflection. So that's a great question. Speaking of reflection, Kylie also mentioned that the Canadian Evaluation Society credentialed evaluator process was a great venue for reflection for her. So that maybe we should all be credentialed evaluators just to promote that meso level of reflection.
I'd just like to weigh in on that real quickly, this is Leslie. And so we actually performed an evaluation some time ago of the CE designation. And that's a relatively common comment that actually came out of that process. So yeah, definitely it's so important to think about like the role of processes like that in helping to facilitate kind of our own reflection and work.
Excellent. We have another question from Lisa about how this might work in a nonprofit where there is a lot of emphasis on accountability to funders. And I'll take a quick stab at that before Anne and Leslie. I have encountered some nonprofits where certainly accountability to funders is there, and it takes a little bit of a paradigm shift, but they can start seeing evaluative thinking as a tool for greater accountability as well. And that's sort of upwards accountability towards the funder, as well as downwards, if you will, accountability towards the purported beneficiaries. Now, it's easier said